He thought it was just another episode, but he was wrong. The red on-air light glowed softly in the corner of the studio, steady and familiar, like a heartbeat that had pulsed through this room for years. Microphones stood ready, headphones rested where they always did. Papers were stacked neatly, marked with notes meant to guide another ordinary morning of laughter, commentary, and music. Outside the glass, producers exchanged casual nods. Nothing about the setup suggested history was about to be made. Steve Harvey had walked into the studio carrying the weight of routine. Radio had taught him rhythm, how to keep a show moving, how to fill silence with humor, how to make strangers feel like family before the next commercial break. The audience listening from their cars and kitchens expected that comfort. They always did. But sometimes, something invisible enters a room before words do. It arrived quietly, hidden inside a call that had been screened like thousands before it, a child's name on a piece of paper, a note scribbled too carefully, as if the person who wrote it already sensed this moment mattered more than airtime. There was no warning bell, no dramatic cue, just a subtle shift in the air, the kind that makes seasoned broadcasters instinctively slow their breath. Steve Harvey glanced down at the notes, then up again, eyes narrowing slightly, not with suspicion, but with focus. He had learned to recognize when a story was not meant to be rushed, when humor needed to step aside, when the show was no longer the most important thing in the room. The call came through. The voice on the other end was small, not timid, just young, the kind of voice that hasn't yet learned how to hide truth behind performance. As the child spoke, the studio seemed to shrink, the walls closing in around something fragile and precious. Every word landed gently, but with weight. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was sincere. There was a number mentioned almost in passing, 3 digits, followed by another, a total that would mean nothing to most people listening. $347. To the child, it was everything. Steve Harvey didn't interrupt. He didn't crack a joke to lighten the mood. He didn't steer the conversation back toward safer ground. Instead, he leaned back slightly, one hand lifting to adjust his headphones as if to hear more clearly, not just the words, but the heart behind them. The producers noticed first, the way his posture changed, the way the room grew still. A radio show runs on momentum, but this moment demanded reverence. The clock kept ticking, but time itself seemed to hesitate. Listeners across the city felt it too. You might have been driving, half-focused on traffic, when suddenly you realized your hands had tightened on the steering wheel. Or standing at a sink, water running, realizing you hadn't moved in several seconds. Something in the child's voice reached through the static and settled somewhere deep and personal. Steve Harvey closed his eyes briefly, not in exhaustion, in recognition. He had heard many stories in his life, stories of struggle, loss, resilience. But every so often, one arrives not to entertain, not even to inspire, but to remind, to strip away the layers of noise and success and schedules, and ask a simple question: what matters right now? The answer came without words. The show could wait. The commercials could wait. The world, loud and impatient, could wait. Because a child was speaking, not asking for charity, not begging for attention, but offering something far more rare: trust, hope. A small, trembling truth placed carefully into the hands of a stranger on the radio. Steve Harvey reached forward and gently lowered his microphone. The music didn't fade in. The producers didn't cut to break. No one moved. For the first time in years, the radio show stopped, not because of technical failure, but because humanity had taken the wheel. And in that suspended silence, with only a child's voice lingering in the air, Steve Harvey made a decision that would ripple far beyond the studio walls. The child's name mattered, but the story behind it mattered more. He was young enough that hope still came easily, but old enough to understand scarcity. Old enough to know what it meant when adults spoke in careful tones late at night. Old enough to recognize the quiet panic that settles into a home when bills stack faster than paychecks. His world was not defined by toys or games, but by numbers overheard from the next room: rent, medicine, groceries, words that carried weight even when no one explained them. The child lived with a caregiver who worked more hours than sleep would allow. Love was abundant, but resources were not. Every dollar had a purpose. Every purchase came with calculation. Birthdays were celebrated with presents instead of presents. Sacrifices were made quietly, so the child would not feel them too sharply. That was how the $347 came to exist. It was not a gift. It was not extra money. It was what remained after careful planning and even more careful hope. Saved slowly, guarded fiercely. Money meant for something specific, something meaningful, something the child believed in with the kind of faith adults often forget how to hold. He had learned about Steve Harvey not from fame, but from laughter drifting out of a radio late at night, a voice that sounded warm, familiar, safe. In a world that felt uncertain, that voice had become a companion. Someone who sounded like he understood struggle without glorifying it. Someone who made room for people who were usually unheard. The child didn't call the show to ask for help. He called to give something. When the producers had first taken the call, they assumed it was a misunderstanding. Children often dream big. They speak in earnest metaphors. But this was different. The amount was precise. The intention was clear. There was no expectation of recognition. Just a quiet wish to honor someone else, someone the child believed deserved kindness more than he did. Steve Harvey learned this in fragments, the way truth often arrives, a sentence at a time, each one gently undoing the assumptions that usually protect adults from being fully affected. Around him, the studio staff shifted. Producers who had seen it all suddenly found their throats tightening. Engineers pretended to adjust levels just to look away for a moment. No one wanted to be the first to admit what they were feeling. Steve Harvey had been that child once, not in circumstance exactly, but in spirit. He remembered what it felt like to hold a small amount of money and believe it could change something. He remembered the courage it took to offer what little you had, knowing it might leave you with nothing. Radio had always been fast for him, quick wit, sharp timing. But this moment demanded slowness, care, respect. He asked questions gently, never prying, never pushing. The child answered honestly, without embellishment. There was no script, no performance, just sincerity spilling out in a voice that cracked not from fear but from emotion too big for a young chest to hold. Listeners began calling the station, not to interrupt, but to say thank you. Lines lit up silently, messages flooded in, unread. The show's structure was dissolving, replaced by something raw and communal. Steve Harvey rested his hands on the desk, grounding himself. He understood now why the notes had felt heavier than usual, why the air had shifted. This was not a story meant to pass through the show and disappear into the archive. This was a moment meant to be honored. The $347 was no longer just a number. It became a symbol of faith, of generosity unmeasured by wealth, of a child who believed that even the smallest offering could carry dignity and meaning. Steve Harvey looked through the glass at his producers. No words were exchanged, but the decision was mutual. They were no longer managing airtime. They were protecting something sacred. He turned back to the microphone, voice softer now, steadier. The show would not move on. Not yet, because when a child gives everything he has, the least the world can do is stop and listen. The studio felt smaller now, as if the walls had leaned in to listen. Steve Harvey asked the child to explain, in his own words, what the money was for. There was a pause on the line, not hesitation, but gathering. The kind of pause that happens when someone wants to be understood exactly right, when the answer matters. The child spoke slowly, about someone in his life who had been hurting quietly, about watching strength every day and not knowing how to help, about believing that honoring that person mattered more than holding on to comfort. The details were simple, but the meaning behind them pressed hard against the room. As the child finished, Steve Harvey did something rare on live radio. He said nothing, seconds stretched. On-air silence is usually a mistake, a threat to pacing and ratings. Producers are trained to fear it. But this silence was different. It was full. It carried respect. It gave the moment space to breathe. Listeners leaned closer to their radios. Some pulled over, some sat down. You might have felt it yourself, that tightening behind the eyes, that warmth rising unexpectedly. Because the child wasn't asking the world to see him. He was asking the world to see someone else. Steve Harvey cleared his throat, not to speak yet, but because emotion had settled there. His voice, when it came, was lower than usual, careful. He thanked the child, not with praise that would turn him into a spectacle, but with gratitude that treated the gesture like what it truly was, an act of dignity. Then he did something no one expected. He told the producers to stop the show. No music, no commercials, no transitions, just presence. He explained to the listeners why, not in grand terms, simply, honestly. He said that sometimes, when something this pure walks into a room, everything else has to step aside, that a radio show exists to serve people, not the other way around. The child stayed on the line, breathing softly, unsure of what was happening, but sensing its importance. Steve Harvey asked permission before going further, asked if it was okay to honor the intention behind the $347 in a way that would protect its meaning. The child agreed, voice steady, trusting. Around the city, the phones began to ring again, not with noise but with solidarity. People offered help, but Steve Harvey gently declined on the child's behalf. This was not a fundraiser. This was not a fundraiser. This was not a moment to be diluted by excess. Instead, Steve Harvey made a promise. He promised that the $347 would not be absorbed into bureaucracy or applause. It would be honored exactly as it was given, as a symbol of love. He committed the show's resources, quietly and deliberately, to ensure that the child's intention would be fulfilled without being overshadowed. The child began to cry then, not loudly, just a soft, overwhelmed sound. The kind that comes when someone realizes their small act has been seen without being taken from them. Steve Harvey stayed with him in that emotion. He did not rush to comfort it away. He let it exist. He told the child that courage does not always look like bravery. Sometimes it looks like kindness offered with empty hands. The studio crew wiped their eyes openly now. No one pretended. The moment had dissolved professional distance. They were no longer broadcasters. They were witnesses. Time lost meaning. What should have been a segment became an hour that no one wanted to end. When the show finally returned, it did so gently, like stepping out of a chapel. Steve Harvey closed the call with care, reminding the child that what he had done mattered, not because of the money, but because of the heart behind it. He told him that the world needs more people who understand generosity before abundance. When the line disconnected, the studio remained quiet. No one rushed to reset, because something irreversible had happened. A child had reminded a room full of adults, and a city full of listeners, that honor is not measured by what you keep, but by what you are willing to give away. What followed did not feel like resolution. It felt like warmth spreading slowly through a place that had been cold for too long. After the call ended, Steve Harvey stayed seated, hands folded, eyes lowered, not in exhaustion, but in reverence. The studio lights hummed softly above him, suddenly less harsh, as if they too had softened their glare. No one rushed him. No one spoke. The room understood that something fragile was still unfolding. Healing rarely announces itself. It arrives quietly, through small decisions made with care. Steve Harvey finally spoke again, but not to the audience first. He turned toward the producers, the engineers, the staff, people who had spent years chasing timing and transitions. He thanked them, not for their work, but for their restraint, for recognizing that compassion sometimes requires getting out of the way. Then he turned back to the microphone. He spoke to the child, knowing the line was still open, knowing that words spoken now would linger far longer than any broadcast. He told him that what he had done was not small, that generosity does not wait for adulthood or abundance, that some people are born already understanding what others spend a lifetime learning. He told him something else too, something deeper, that it was not his job to carry the weight of the world, that his kindness was a gift, not a burden, that he was allowed to be a child, even as his heart showed uncommon strength. The child listened quietly. You could almost hear the nod on the other end of the line. Steve Harvey made sure the caregiver was acknowledged as well, the unseen figure behind the story. The sacrifices that never made it to the microphone, the love that held a household together without recognition. He honored that devotion without prying into details, without turning it into content. The healing in that moment was not dramatic. No sudden cheers, no triumphant music. It was collective exhale. Listeners later described it the same way, as if the city breathed out together, as if something clenched had finally loosened. People who had tuned in for distraction stayed for connection. People who felt invisible felt recognized without being exposed. Steve Harvey understood that healing does not come from fixing everything. It comes from seeing clearly and responding with care. After the show, he followed through on his promise quietly. No cameras, no press releases. The child's intention was fulfilled exactly as it was given, intact, respected, unaltered. Additional support was offered discreetly, without conditions, without headlines. The goal was never to be seen doing good. It was to protect the meaning of the act itself. Weeks passed. The story did not fade, but it changed shape. It traveled not as a viral clip, but as a memory people shared in softer tones. "Did you hear that day?" they would ask. "Do you remember when the radio stopped?" Parents told their children about it. Teachers referenced it gently, not as inspiration porn, but as proof that kindness does not require permission. Steve Harvey carried the moment with him. It reshaped the way he listened. He slowed down more often, let silence linger longer, asked questions that made space instead of filling it. The child's voice had reminded him why he had chosen radio in the first place, not to speak, but to connect. For the child, something shifted too, not into pride, but into assurance. The knowledge that doing the right thing, even when it costs, is never wasted, that adults can be trusted sometimes, that the world does notice quiet goodness. You can imagine him, years later, remembering that call, not as a moment of attention, but as a moment of being taken seriously. That is what healing looks like. Not applause, not rewards, just the quiet understanding that your heart matters, and the world paused long enough to prove it. Years passed, but the moment never truly left. It lived on in the pauses Steve Harvey allowed during interviews, in the way he leaned forward when someone spoke softly, in the instinct to protect sincerity from becoming spectacle. It shaped choices no audience ever saw, calls returned late at night, conversations kept private, kindness offered without an exit strategy. People would still ask about that day, about the child, about the $347. About why a seasoned broadcaster would risk momentum, ratings, and routine for a single phone call. Steve Harvey never answered with philosophy. He answered with memory, because what endured was not the interruption of a radio show, but the reminder of what power is meant to do, not dominate, not impress, but create space. Space where the smallest voice can be heard without being consumed. The child grew older, carrying that day like a quiet compass, not as a story to tell strangers, but as a reference point, a moment when the world responded to goodness without trying to own it. He learned that generosity does not always return in the same form. Sometimes it returns as confidence, sometimes as peace, sometimes as the courage to stay kind even when life gets harder. The caregiver continued forward too, strengthened not by charity, but by respect. By the knowledge that sacrifice had been witnessed without judgment, that love offered in silence had been honored, not dissected, and listeners, millions of them, carried something subtle but lasting. They remembered how the radio sounded when it stopped being entertainment and became something closer to prayer. They remembered that stillness could be shared, that empathy could travel through wires and speakers and land intact in the human heart. No awards marked the moment, no plaque was hung, it didn't need one. Because its impact wasn't measured in recognition, but in recalibration. People gave differently after that. They listened more carefully. They taught their children that generosity isn't about excess, it's about intention. That honor doesn't come from the size of a gift, but from the sincerity behind it. Steve Harvey would later reflect privately that success had given him many things: platforms, influence, opportunity. But moments like that reminded him why those things mattered at all. Not to amplify his voice, but to lower it when necessary, to step aside so someone else could be seen. Sometimes, the greatest use of a microphone is knowing when to set it down. The radio show continued, as all things do. New episodes, new laughter, new stories. But woven into its history was that day when a child taught a room full of adults how to measure wealth, not in dollars, but in courage, not in airtime, but in attention. Sometimes television doesn't just entertain, it heals. If this story touched your heart, subscribe and share, so the world never forgets moments like these. This is Stories Left Behind, where human stories are never lost.